part of the reason that there's so little enthusiasm for taxing services at a lower rate or reducing the total rate could have something to do with the last three tax changes, which should have been revenue neutral. Number one, the 1% increase in the sales tax, and number two, the recent change in the business license taxes, both of which resulted in huge increases in the amount of taxes collected. Do you think that, how many times do you think the taxpayers are going to believe this, that this change will be revenue neutral?
Well, I think Roy and I are going to disagree about this one. Well, I think it's logical to want to capture a growing area of consumption in your tax base, which is services. I have two reasons for arguing that, in fact, I would not want to go down that road. And I think Roy's also heard these before, but that's okay. You can hear them again. And one is that I think for political reasons, you cannot, and some would argue humane reasons, it depends on what you're looking at, you cannot tax those areas which are going to raise you some real dollars, which are things like legal fees and physicians' fees. And you're not going to tax things like newspaper advertising unless you want every editorial page in the state to yell at you. So that, and those are really kind of where a lot of the revenue is raised. And so I think it's going to be hard to raise big bucks. Plus, of course, you are raising a tax, and you don't really want to raise it if it's an input to business services anyway, so you don't want to go the line where, you could tax a divorce, but not a business that needs a lawyer's service. I don't think, but as I said, I think it's going to be hard to raise big dollars. It's not a tax that's deductible at the federal level, and so it's kind of a gift to the federal government when you raise your tax revenue that way. And I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to end up extending taxes to a lot of small business, and the cost of administering and enforcing that kind of tax on, haircuts and whatever things haven't been caught since the 60s that have arisen will probably generate more ill will and paperwork than it's really worth it. I mean, if you were to tell me that you go back after the big sources of revenue, that's one thing, but I think that it would be very, very hard politically to do that.
I don't know that those earlier reforms were supposed to be revenue neutral. I got here about the time they were debating them, but I don't remember that as part of the story. I know that they argued over the sales tax rate as a trade-off on the food issue by the time I was getting here. So I don't know about that part. But revenue neutral is, the governor said this time he wasn't interested in revenue neutral. He was interested only in tax reduction. So in this political climate, even revenue neutral isn't an acceptable thing to talk about. But on services, with all due respects to my knowledgeable friend, I think we have to tax services. It's fair. It just plain old isn't fair for you to have to pay a higher rate of tax on a pair of jeans or a frying pan, and for somebody else to not have to pay any tax because he or she chooses to consume something different. In Georgia, for example, you can run a list of about 35 personal services that people people could pay tax on. In at least one other state they do tax. Everything from telephone calls to Mabel in the middle of the night, to going to the tan-in saloon, to storing your fur, to getting your dog clipped, all these kinds of things that go on and on. And there's a long set of those services that are outside. It's just not fair not to make people pay tax on those. Of that 30 in Georgia, this true story, there's only 2 of them that we tax of all those personal services, diapers and funerals. Coming and going and nothing in between. Most states tax long-distance telephone calls. We don't tax long-distance telephone calls. Do you know that 30% of the sales tax we have now is paid by business anyway? You're not going to be able to exempt business freely from that sales tax, even though you would like to. You're going to have to make it up to them somewhere else. So I think it's coming. is going to have to come, because people aren't going to sit still for 9 and 10% sales tax rates. You're just not going to like that.